Hi friends, I hope you're having a good morning, evening, whenever you find yourself watching this video. We had a great time worshiping together last week at Washington Park, and this week we're at Lincoln Park worshiping together. So if you're not able to be joining us in person, we just want you to know that we love you and we miss you and we're thinking about you. So as we worship together with this first song, just believe these truths, speak them and sing them over your homes, wherever you are this morning.
Jesus, I believe that, and I pray that over all of these homes. Wherever each of you are, I pray the truth and the beauty of Jesus' name over you. That every stronghold would be broken, that you would find freedom in him. Yeah, amen. It's great to worship with you. I hope that you are singing with us wherever you find yourself. Just a couple of quick announcements before we do the rest of the service here. You get to hear from Julius, which many of you guys know who he is, just a good friend of Bruce Cities. And so we look forward to that in just a minute. But first, just real quick. It's great to worship together. In just a few minutes, you're going to get to hear from Randy and then from Julius, a good friend of Bruce Cities. Many of you know him. But before that, I just want to remind you, if you are able to get out and join us for worship in person, we've been having such a good time being able to see each other and be out at the parks. There's the ability to just distance however you feel comfortable. But this next coming Sunday, we're going to be at Greenfield Park. So we have 2 more weeks of moving around the city. Greenfield Park is the next one. So we're just doing 10 a.m. service just as normal, but at Greenfield Park. You can look for any information about that on our social media pages as well as brucecitychurch.org. And then for those of you who do call Bruce City your home, those of you watching, we just have a chance for you to continue your giving, and you'll see a slide that just lets you know the different ways that you can give. And we just always, as usual, so grateful for your generosity, especially during this time. So with that, we get to have a chance to hear a good word from Randy as well as Julius. So love you.
Hey friends, so good to be with you. So good to be seen by you. I was going to say so good to see you, but that would be disingenuous because this is Thursday afternoon for me. Sunday morning for you. I'm excited that you're watching. I'm excited that you're journeying with us as a church, that you're not giving up gathering together, even though we have a pandemic on our hands, even though it's really hard to gather together, even though we're doing whatever it takes to do that. I'm excited that you have made the choice to journey with us, because this is important stuff, I think. This week is week 2 out of 4 talking about racism in the church, talking about the history of race in the church. Things that we need to talk about. Last week, as I started talking, I gave a number of reasons why we're continuing to talk about this stuff, why we're continuing to talk about racism and racism in the church historically, why it's so hard for us to talk about this as a church sometimes. I gave all sorts of reasons, because of the gospel, because of the kingdom, because of the Holy Spirit compelling me and calling us, because of my black pastor friends, brothers and sisters. I just got today another reminder of why we're doing this series, why we feel like it's best to do a series like this. Today I saw statistics from the Barna Research Group, which is a very trustworthy and reputable research group that they do polling, and they've polled people last year and this year. And at this point in 2019 compared to this point in 2020, and the question was, are you motivated to help end racial injustice? Are you motivated to help end racial injustice and to address racial injustice? And what we find is that white Christians in this poll are less motivated in 2020 to fight against racial injustice than they were in 2019. Let me say that again. White Christians, white followers of Jesus, people who are active, consider themselves, they actively go to church, they actively participate in ministries. These are practicing Christians. They are less likely in 2020, with all that's gone on in our world in this last year, in this last summer, they're less likely to be motivated to address racial injustice this year than they were last year at this time. That blows me away. Likewise, they say that they are actually not motivated or extremely unmotivated more this year than last year. Now, if you look at our black and brown brothers and sisters, the stats are flipped. Our black and brown brothers and sisters, Christians, African American Christians, are way more motivated this year to address racial injustice than they were in 2019. And there's way fewer who are not motivated to address racial injustice. What does that tell you, friends? I'll tell you what it tells me. It tells me that, first of all, we need to be listening for the Spirit of God. But second, we need to be listening to our black and brown brothers and sisters who are extremely motivated to see this as a moment in our nation's history and in the church history. To me, this is why we're doing this. And in that poll, over a third of white Christians said the voice they want to hear from most about racial injustice is their pastor, is their church leader, followed second only by the U.S. president. And I would say, I would bet you any money that when it really comes down to it, the person that matters most to them as far as what they're saying about racial injustice is their pastor. I'm not trying to make myself feel good about myself or make you feel good about me. I'm just saying people listen to their pastors. That's why the church needs to be talking about this. I know that there are so many pastors who are unwilling to share about this because it's a hot button, because it's controversial, because it's going to cost them. Friends, this is why we need to talk about this. This morning, week 2, today we're talking about trauma. Trauma, particularly in the African American community. Now, I didn't write the notes or I didn't write the outline for these messages. I tweaked them and made them my own. Last week I made it my own as well, but I'm trying to stick to my friend's outline and notes. And this sermon was mostly written by a African American pastor, a black pastor friend of mine. And as I read over these notes this week, I got a little nervous. I didn't get nervous because it's challenging. I got nervous because I realized that I am really quite unqualified to preach this sermon. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about a clinical problem, psychological problem. And I am not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor. I'm not qualified to talk about trauma in competent ways. Likewise, I am not a black person. I am not a black man. I have not lived out that reality. And so I feel pretty incompetent to preach this sermon, I got to tell you. So this week I consulted an expert friend of mine in the psychology field, and this week we're going to hear from a friend of mine who is a black man, and he's going to get the chance to share with us. So when we think about trauma, everyone knows what trauma is, right? It's associated with PTSD. It's just associated with holding things in, and you don't even know when you're experiencing trauma and when you're dealing with trauma, you don't know that it's trauma. You just think this is the way that the world works. This is the way that my world is. This is reality. But when we think about trauma and we think about the African American community, what we're going to be thinking about today is how in the middle 19th century, when slavery was abolished, beautiful things happened, and 4 million human beings were released from bondage, given liberation. 3.9 million, 4 million black Africans were released from their bondage. And what happened then is you had 4 million people who had been unbelievably, savagely traumatized, and they didn't know about it. They didn't know that they were traumatized. They didn't know that this trauma that they dealt with was something that needed to be addressed, that needed to be exposed and brought to the light, and they needed to find healing from it in order to be whole people. And what we're going to be thinking about this morning is how trauma, when it's not addressed, is actually passed down. We're going to be thinking about how trauma, when it's not addressed, when it's not brought into the light, when we're not giving those healing measures in that healing journey, it's actually turns a person into subhuman in many ways. And if it's not addressed and that person has children or family, then that trauma is passed down. So here's where I consulted an expert. I consulted somebody that, if you're part of Bruce City, if you've been part of Bruce City for a while now, you know very well. Her name is Jenny Heckman. Jenny's a great friend of mine. She was a colleague of mine when we were pastors together at Bruce City Church for several years. And then Jenny went into full-time counseling practice. Jenny taught counseling classes at Mount Mary University. So she is an expert. And I talk to her this week. I wanted to have her in. I wanted her to be able to talk with us, but she couldn't. There's family things going on, good family things going on, that she couldn't be here. So I talked to her on the phone, and I told her this thesis that the African American community has really been passing down trauma since they were released from slavery, since they were enslaved by white Americans. And I asked her, does that hold water? Does that hold weight? Can trauma be passed down? And Jenny said immediately, absolutely yes. There's all sorts of research that shows that trauma can be and is passed down if it's not addressed, if there's not that healing journey, if it's not named, if it's not known. Trauma is absolutely handed down and passed down, primarily through modeling, and then all sorts of other ways. She also said that trauma can be passed down in a person's DNA, that if a mother, while pregnant, is in a traumatic situation, or has extremely traumatic encounter, or is traumatized during the whole course of that pregnancy, her child's DNA will be affected by that trauma that the mother experienced. And that child will be affected in potentially profound ways, mental illness, and all sorts of other ways. So I asked Jenny, does trauma get passed down? And she said, absolutely yes. That doesn't mean that it's hopeless, but it is a reality, and it needs to be addressed. It needs to be brought into the light. So trauma can be passed down, and what we find is that maybe we have a whole people group in the United States who have generationally been passing down trauma, shared trauma. What happens when a person is traumatized? Even a people group is traumatized. But what happens when you've been traumatized? Maybe some of you that I'm talking to this morning or this evening, whenever you're watching, have been traumatized. You've gone through, maybe you're a veteran. Maybe you've been assaulted. Maybe there's all sorts of things. And if this is a trigger for you, please stop watching. I should have given you a trigger warning in the beginning. I've gone through a situation that I had to actually process a trauma. And I didn't know it. I just had the blessing of having therapist friends and counselor friends like Jenny who were able to help me with that. But what happens when you're traumatized and you experience trauma and you're living in trauma and you don't know it is you begin to manifest these self-destructive behaviors. It is I'm not an expert, but I would say it is regular for victims of trauma to turn to self-destructive habits. Self-destructive habits look like hurting yourself. Carried out, it looks like suicide. Self-destructive habits looks like alcoholism and drug addiction. Self-destructive habits looks like self-sabotaging. Self-destructive habits, because of trauma, looks like procrastination. Self-destructive habits looks like self-sabotage. Again, this is not something that we're making up. This is clinical. This is proven. This is science. And the question is, what if we have a whole people group in the United States who have experienced trauma, are experiencing trauma, and they're passing it on because it hasn't been brought to the light. The point of this is hopefully that we can actually bring this to light, that we can understand our brothers and sisters in deeper and more profound and real ways, that we can ask questions as the white church about our African American brothers and sisters' experience. That we can bring this to light, because when you do that, healing starts to happen. Now this reality of a nation of people who were enslaved, and maybe that did something to them, that affected them. This might actually just be a biblical reality that we see modeled in the scriptures. Let me turn to, and if you have your Bibles, if you're like me and you just like using your own Bible, push pause, go grab your Bible, and then come back and turn to Exodus 15. Exodus 15, this is after the nation of Israel, the Hebrews, had been enslaved for, I think, 400 years. And God performed all these miracles in really, they were miracles to the Israelites, plagues and disaster for the Egyptians. But God delivers his people after 430 years of slavery. They walk through the Red Sea miraculously. God parts the ocean and they walk right through it, and they're delivered and they are liberated for the first time in more than 4 centuries, generation upon generation upon generation, enslaved, treated horribly. And then we find this narrative in Exodus 15. This is Exodus 15, starting in verse 22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came back to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why it's called Marah. It means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Another miracle. You're welcome, Israel. And then the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near water at an oasis. Brilliant. Israelites grumble. I know you're familiar, most of us, if you're familiar with this church, or the church, you're familiar with this passage. Let's go on. In chapter 16, verse 1, it says, the whole Israelite community, the whole nation of Israel, set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 7th month after they had come out of second month after they had come out of Egypt. This is 2.5 months after they left Egypt. They're liberated. They're free. It's amazing. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If we had only died by the Lord's hand in Egypt! There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Now, how many of us have read that and had the thought, what's wrong with you people? Like, Israel, you were enslaved for 430 years. You were crying out, it says in the scriptures, for generations to God for deliverance. He gave it to you. He liberated you. He gave you freedom. And now 2.5 months later, you are complaining and saying, if only we had died, or if only we could go back to slavery in Egypt? How many of I've preached this text before and used it as this kind of model for grumbling and whining and complaining and contentment and faith in God. But as I read this, and as I think about this reality of trauma that happens to a enslaved and oppressed people group, I realize that, see, what I do is I put my situation and my reality into the scriptures, and I think the Israelites are just like me. And when I say just like me, I hope you know what I mean. When I say just like me, I mean a comfortable person. I live in comfort. I live well. I don't have a lot of major worries. I am a first world American. You could go on down the list to say, like, I live a good life. And I take my reality and put it on the Israelites and have the same expectations for them. The reality, friends, is that the Israelites that we're talking about, the Israelites that I've made a habit of bashing really regularly, they are a marginalized people group. It's easy for us to forget or never even realize in our lives that the people that the Bible was written both for and the people that the Bible was written by were marginalized people groups. Through the course of their history, Israel almost was never not oppressed or marginalized. Really. I mean, they were enslaved numerous times as a people. They were it almost seems as if they were enslaved more than they were not, whether it's by the Egyptians or by the Babylonians, by the Assyrians, you name it. That was just regular modus operandi. And That's who the scriptures were written to, a marginalized, oppressed people group. That's who the scriptures were written by, is by that marginalized and oppressed people group. The New Testament is no different. The early church was oppressed by the Roman Empire. The empire didn't like them. But we read the Bible through the lenses of the empire. I don't know if that's offensive. I hope it's not, but it's true. So what if maybe what we find here in Exodus 15 and 16, the grumbling of the Israelites, longing to go back into captivity, what if that's just the cries of a traumatized people group who don't really know how to be free? Who it's scary to have that experience. I'm not saying this is exactly why. I'm not saying we've got it right here. This is the truth. I'm just saying it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? This is an extremely traumatized nation, people group. What could that mean for them? What kind of self-destructive habits did the Israelites have because of this trauma? What might have this 430 years, half a millennia in slavery done to the Israelites? And many of the struggles, perhaps, some of the struggles that we find in the Old Testament, what if it's partially responsible? What if that trauma is partially responsible for that culture? I don't know. But this is what we do with the scriptures. We seek guidance, we seek the Holy Spirit, we seek the scholars, and we do this, we process together. Now, when it comes to the traumatization, the traumatic reality for African Americans historically, and I would say even currently in the United States of America, that's again an area where I'm just not qualified to speak into. But thanks be to God, I have a good friend who is. Julius Coates is somebody that many of you guys at Bruce City Church know that name. You know Julius, you love him. He was part of Bruce City for several years. Amazing, profound part of Bruce City Church. A gift to me personally. I got to baptize Julius. That was one of the gifts of my ministry life. And Julius, he shared before about his experience as a black man growing up in Milwaukee in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I've asked Julius to share. He's not in Milwaukee. He now lives in Kansas City, but we have this amazing thing called Zoom. So Julius and I Skyped earlier, and I want to share Julius's story with you about trauma in the black community. Julius, good morning. Good to see you, my friend.
Good morning, Randy.
How are you in Kansas City?
Doing well. Doing very well. Enjoying it. It's a nice day, nice sunny day out.
Awesome.
That's always a good start.
Good. Well, I'm glad to see you. We miss you at Bruce City. We miss you in Milwaukee, but I'm glad you're doing well in Kansas City. We, obviously, Julius, I've talked to you ahead of time. We're talking about trauma in the black community in America and what that reality is like. And as I sat down to look at my notes, because these notes were literally written by a black pastor in Milwaukee, I quickly realized that on a number of fronts, I'm not qualified to teach this, to preach this sermon. This is not my experience, and I don't know nearly enough about it. And so you came to mind as someone who is just really generous with your story. You love being vulnerable and honest, and creating an environment where understanding is just the way we operate. So thanks for being willing to join us this morning.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to add my own opinion to whether or not you are a good person to do this. I think you're the excellent person to preach this sermon. Not because you've had the racism experience, but that you are open to learning and you have an open heart about these situations. So that's what really counts.
Thank you, Julius. That's amazing. Yeah. So as we think about trauma and have talked through trauma up to this point, can you just tell us about your experience and how and if you were affected by trauma as in your childhood, in your youth, in your adulthood, young adulthood, or whatever? What's your experience with trauma as a black man, black youth, black child been?
I'll just start with, I was born into a family of two parents who already had been traumatized in their own ways. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. But I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where all the excitement has been.
Crazy. Yep.
And my parents and my siblings lived in a housing project that was something built back in World War II that they had after Ramler Corporation recruited all these black folks from the South, my dad included. They gave them housing in this old housing unit. So that's where I started off. And it was very segregated. And that was part of what I was going to talk about today, was that even at the age of like 5 years old, I was aware that I was a human being that was limited to this environment. And if I go outside of that environment, it was very dangerous.
At 5 years old.
Not to go outside. At 5 years old, I knew that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little background. So also at 5 years old, while I was in kindergarten, I had my first situation that I can identify was a racially driven act on the part of the teacher. When I was in kindergarten, we used to have nap time. And at the end of nap time, the teacher would hand this little wand to one of the kids, and that kid would walk around the circle. There were probably, I'm not sure, 8, 10 of us. And that person would tap you, and that would mean you wake up and you get up, you get to sit up and stand up and all this. I was never picked during the whole year of kindergarten. I was the only black child in the class.
The only one?
Yes.
Wow.
And because it was the year that I started kindergarten that they allowed us black kids to go to the public school, the new public school that had just been built about maybe 2 blocks from where we lived.
In what year around was this, Julius?
This would have been, I was born in 53, so that would have been like 58.
Okay. So this is before integration happened in Milwaukee and many other communities.
Oh, yeah. There was no integration in Kenosha.
Mm.
No, no, they didn't play that. So, and I remembered that traumatizing. It was traumatizing in that I would lay there thinking, okay, Billy's been picked 3 times. Sally's been picked 3 or 4 times. John, everybody's been picked all these times, and I still haven't been picked.
Mm-hmm.
So there was those kind of experiences that I remember. And then in first grade, I had older siblings, and I learned how to count and read and all the rest of that earlier than most of my peers. And I was in first grade, and I was never picked to read, even though I had read all the books already. I read those same books when my older siblings had read it, and so I knew how to read,
Mm-hmm.
but I wasn't picked.
Never. Yeah.
So what the trauma I got from that was that that was the beginning sense of invisibility. And if you really want to traumatize someone, ignore them.
Wow. Wow.
We as human beings have that need to be acknowledged by other human beings, and not being acknowledged on a consistent basis is traumatizing.
Wow.
It's particularly to a vulnerable child who's developing who they are and where they fit in, letting them know that they don't fit in and they don't exist.
Yeah. And
It's very traumatizing.
And that's not something that you process as a child, right? Elementary school kid. You just begin learning that I'm invisible here. I don't matter here. But you're not saying, oh, and I think this is building trauma in me. I think this is affecting my person in myself, right?
No, it's just, God damn, that hurts.
Yeah, yeah.
Why don't they see me? Why don't they see me? And you know, that reminds me of when I think I was 17 or 18, I read this book that really spoke to me on that. This book called Invisible I think it was Invisible, by Richard Wright. And I would suggest anybody that wants to understand what that is about to pick it up. It's a short read.
Yep.
So
anything else from your, that's your childhood, anything from your youth or young adulthood, how that trauma began hardening or setting in, or, your experience?
Yeah, then there was, when I was around 9 years old, we moved to Milwaukee. And that summer after moving there, two of my brothers and I were walking down 3rd Street, around 3rd and I'm thinking it had been around 3rd and Brown, because we lived on 5th and Brown.
Okay.
So it was around 3rd and Garfield in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And this cop car pulled up. These cops get out the car, and they come over and say, well, why'd you guys break that window or something? I'm like, what? I don't break the window. And I didn't say hardly anything, and this cop kicked me. So
You're how old?
I was about 9. I was 9.
9, getting kicked by...
Yeah, I got kicked in the back by this cop. And here I had been told cops are supposed to be there to protect you, and here this guy is telling me I'm a liar and kicking me.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then later on, another very imprinting kind of incident was I was threatened by a cop that if I didn't do something, didn't tell my brother or whatever, that he was going to put me in the morgue with the dead people.
Wow.
And at 9 years old, that scared the woo-hoo out of me.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I started saying anything he wanted at that point. So,
yeah.
So I felt very vulnerable. Like, okay, he's going to put me in this is a big old, cop.
Mm-hmm.
He's an adult.
And I mean, I appreciate you focusing on your childhood, because I think my counselor and therapist friends would say in your childhood is where you're imprinted as a person. In your childhood is when you learn about the world and you build your person and your reality based on what you've learned in your formative years, in your first 10 years of life, right? So
that's very true. And with that was also, and I didn't bring any of that up, but I was also getting very clear messages, sometimes stated very verbally direct. These are places you can go as a black person, as a colored person, we would say back then.
Mm-hmm.
Here's places that if you're a colored person, you can't go, or if you do go, you are at higher risk of being harmed.
Yep.
And nobody's going to save you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very clearly stated.
Yep.
So then by the time, let's just move forward till I was like 13 years old, that's when we're talking like 64, 65 in there. That's when I started getting involved with the political action and doing the marches and all that. And I did the march across the bridge for housing, open up housing in Milwaukee, because people like your age, you had no idea about that. But prior to when you were born, black people were not allowed to live on the other side, the south side of the viaduct. Mm-hmm. We could move up to the viaduct and out to north as far as like Capitol, but we could not go south over the viaduct. You could go over there, but you had to get your ass out of there before dark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we had the march over there, and I remember during the march with Father Grappi, Father Dismas, and those people, and being stoned, people throwing bricks and stones at us and yelling, "Nigger, go home," and we don't want you here, go back to Africa, and feeling very threatened. I didn't myself get hit, but I was with other people that did get hit.
Yep. Yep.
And so, okay, those kind of things are traumatizing. Like, oh, there's a lot of, you feel that hate, and you don't know what have I ever done to be the object of such an, intense amount of hate.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and that's a consistent theme that is traumatizing and re-traumatizing just about any black person, particularly in my age group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then as a young adult, I became a firefighter, professional firefighter. And I did the training and did very well at the training and got placed into a fire station, Engine 18 on 3rd and Ring. And one of my first days there, a couple of the guys after hours, like at night, you know, you work 24-hour shifts. Well, after we had, you know, the day had gone past, sometime in the evening, where you sit around just kind of talking, a couple of guys let me know, a couple of white guys let me know that they really didn't appreciate me being there. That they didn't think that most black people had the aptitude to be a good firefighter, so they didn't trust me.
Just in conversation.
Just, you know, just sitting around in front of the TV after dinner conversation, like, hey, we hate you. We don't think that you're much of a human being, you know.
And by this point, this isn't new to you, right?
No. I was already, I had an older brother that was a firefighter already.
Mm-hmm.
And he had kind of prepped me for this. He had prepped me for it. This is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I heard all of that, I was like, well, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. One of them in particular, though, took it upon himself that he was going to get me fired because I was on probation. You're on probation for a year. He had been on the job for like 3 years or whatever. He knew that I would get fired if we got in a fight. So he would do things to antagonize me,
mm-hmm.
so that I would punch him in the face. Like,
mm-hmm.
even to the point of saying things like, all black women are whores and all this. And I'm going, dude, I have a sister, I have a mother,
mm-hmm.
sisters, you know. Well, they're all, you know, if they're not whores and prostitutes and they're thinking about doing it. And he'd say things like that. And I would have to really struggle.
Yeah.
To, like, okay, is this job really worth it? Because I want to take his ass out.
Yep. I mean, none of this is new to anyone listening, I don't think. You know, we've heard stories like this, but the reality that this is, I think it's so hard I'm not a proponent of, you know, white people carrying shame because we're white, you know, or, you know, the whole white guilt thing. But if we can't get into that story and imagine what that would feel like to live your whole life feeling like you don't belong unless you're in this tight, tiny little ghetto, basically, an area that's been manufactured and made for you, that you've been forced into, and you have nowhere to go outside that, whether it's in the school system, whether it's with your peers, whether it's in your workplace that you earned, that you worked hard to get that firefighter job. And then hearing from your coworkers being rejected like that, I just can't. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and it's making me full of rage, actually, as I listen to you, because I can't imagine what a life that would be, where you just know you're going to be hated. And even if they don't say it, right, and this is kind of the reality in some ways today, you wouldn't hear that as much today, but you probably have been in many experiences, even in the last 20 years, where you know that you're not welcome, or you know that you're the odd one that everyone's uncomfortable with. I mean, I'm sure you've had experiences like that in the last 20 years.
Plenty of times in the past week.
Yeah.
And now what you're referring to there is what's labeled as microaggression.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's where people, a white person will see you walking down the street and you see that look, and females will clutch their purse a little closer.
Mm-hmm.
The white guy will kind of find somewhere else to divert his eyes and
mm-hmm.
make sure that as you're passing, there's a little bit more distance. And it's become much more subtle, but it's there. And once you have the real deal, you become pretty well tuned into the subtle displayed.
Yes.
And it's not just my imagination. I'm not going to allow anybody to discount it as that's just my imagination or just my experience, because I'm only one of several million Black people out here. and I know that my experiences are unique in some ways, but the general area of those experiences, the meaning behind them, it's pretty universal.
Yeah. Do you mind me asking, just as we talk about,
Go ahead.
You've talked to us through some stories, and again, I just want to highlight, I'm certain we could talk all day with you telling stories throughout your life, and maybe all week,
for days.
right? For days, yeah. But for the sake of time, could you just tell us, we're talking about trauma. You probably, I'm assuming again, you even mentioned you didn't know it was trauma that was affecting you, but trauma has an effect on our lives. Trauma affects the way you see yourself. Trauma affects the way you live your life without even knowing it, getting into self-destructive habits and getting into just all sorts of things. How did that play out for you?
How it played out for me? Okay. Well, it played a significant part of my turning to the use of mood-altering substances in an abusive way, so that I was abusing substances. And it was ripping my life apart. And that went on for a few years. And that's how my trauma really, how I tried to manage the trauma, how I tried to make sense of my confusion and all those things. So
self-medicating to
escape. I was really heavy self-medicating. Well, prior to or alongside with that, as that was growing, was I had bouts of depression. There were times where I was depressed for years at a time that I didn't know it, but I can look back and see. I've been through a lot of years of therapy also. So my insight to my internal dynamics have improved quite a bit. I did not know these things as they were happening. This is now. Now I can see these things. And it had a lot to do with my using substances and other behaviors that were inappropriate, that weren't healthy. And what happened, this is the happen part, is that I ended up in substance abuse treatment, where I got treatment for substance abuse and mental health issues of my depression. And out of that, I got involved in, that was the jumping point into Alcoholics Anonymous, where then I started developing a healthier spiritual life, a healthier physical life, and a healthier mental life. With the mental life, I've gone and gotten the help of a professional therapist on several occasions when stuff comes up, and it's like, well, I'm just really suffering. I've come to the belief now, I totally believe, and it has worked for me, and that is that when I'm suffering, I don't have to suffer alone. I need to open up and get someone to help me. And sometimes that's a professional, because sometimes it's not a good idea to burden my friends with that responsibility. That's another thing, is I have a very intentionally developed system of support. Outside of my biological family, there are people in my life that's part of that. That's the real reason why we're communicating, is that they support me, I support them. It's a mutual support system. So that's where things are now. And to answer your final question before you get to it, what can
and I want to emphasize to people, I didn't show Julius my notes. When we talked already about the outcomes and the products of trauma, things like mental illness, depression, addiction, all self-destructive habits. Julius basically is showing us that this is not just theoretical, this is just real lived experience. So go ahead, Julius, and answer my last question before I ask it.
What can white people do? Okay. Real simple. Not a really complex thing. Everybody's life is individualized life or a little complicated, but act on love.
Mm-hmm.
Act on love and not fear.
Okay, explain that.
What that means is a lot of racism is based in and is supported and increased and reinforced with fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear of, oh my God, that black person is going to hurt me. Oh my God, the black person is going to do that to my family. Oh my God, I'm going to lose this. No, that's fear. Love is something more like, I see you and I are both created by God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You are going through a struggle of just living on this planet. I'm going through the struggle of living on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
We both have hope and dreams. We have people we care about that we want to do well, that we're concerned about. We are concerned about our own selves.
Mm-hmm.
Extend that to that other person.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of what their skin color looks like. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Act on love. Like, okay, I can identify with you. You can identify with me. We know that God created both of us
Mm-hmm.
for His purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And not act on fear. When somebody is fomenting fear, I think we need to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
Look at it and say, that's fear. It's fear. That's what this is. This is engendering a fear response in me. Is that who I want to be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to extend that into, and I hope this isn't just too general, but to extend that into what do you do on a daily basis is to fix and heal yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like I talked about, I was born into a family of, parents who had been already traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
Racism is institutionalized in our environment, in the United States, in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all affected by it. White, black, Hispanic, we're all affected by it. As I've gone through my healing process and I continue on that journey of healing, I'm suggesting that white people need to be able to do that too.
Mm-hmm.
You need to heal from your racism.
Mm-hmm.
And saying I'm not a racist is okay, but it's not accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you've done that internal work of identifying some of your own racial attitudes.
Yeah.
You cannot have been born and raised in the United States without having taken on some of that.
Absolutely.
You have to have taken it on. If you've ever turned on your TV, you ever drove down the street and look at a billboard, you've been inundated with racist kinds of beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Own it, so then you can start doing something with that.
Yep.
You can start doing something, but as long as you're denying, well, I'm not a racist, then you're not going to do anything. And it's anybody that's ever had therapy, had any kind of involvement in kind of therapeutic process, knows that you can't fix something you don't identify.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, because I know this is a sensitive topic for, let's just be honest, for white people. But let me just personalize it, right? Let me tell a story. My family, we live in Wauwatosa, extremely white community, and we have my in-laws get us a pass to the Tosa pool every summer. So we go to the pool all the time. It's great. And last summer, I like to think of myself as a very, in terms of racism, racial equality, I like to think of myself as a fairly progressive person. I'm trying my best to create a space that promotes equality, justice, all that stuff. No racism. But what happened last summer is I was sitting around, my kids were in the pool, I was sitting reading, and African-American family, black family, comes and sits down next to me. It's great. And I wish I remembered more of the circumstance, but the long story short, there was one probably 16, 17-year-old young man in the family who was alone, sitting there right behind me. And I was with my phone, put my phone down, felt like I knew where it was, went into the pool, came back 10 minutes later, and my phone was not in the spot that I remembered, right? Instantly, my instant thought was, this kid just went through my phone. And I was looking at him, angry, going through my stuff to see if it's even there. And finally, all of a sudden, found it in a place that my mind remembered in that moment. I put it there. But my first thought was, this 16-year-old kid just messed with my phone. And I knew in that moment, I sat down. It was an amazing experience. And I don't mean amazing in a good way, but I mean I had this out-of-body experience of, I like to credit myself and think of myself as a person who likes to have these conversations, likes to promote equality, justice, all that stuff. And I just profiled this innocent black youth just because of the color of his skin. I had to come to grips with that reality in that moment. And I just sat there for a good 10 minutes. I didn't say I'm sorry to him because we didn't interact at all, and I didn't want to put that on him, or I didn't know if that was appropriate. I still don't know if that would have been appropriate or not. But I just sat there with that reality that I just did that. And I share that to just share with people who are watching us. I think that's in most of us, just to be totally honest. If it's
got to be because you've been programmed with that. We've all been programmed with that. That's how you as a white person was programmed. I as a black person was programmed similarly. So and that's how we start healing this. We start healing our community by owning those programming that,
and so talking about
disconnect us. Yeah, by talking about it. Yeah, by talking about it. And not shaming, not talking in a shaming way. No, we don't need that. Nobody needs to be shamed. I don't need to be shamed. You don't need to be shamed. That's not how we work. Just owning that, I guess in a situation like that, I'd say a good way to look at it is, I guess I have been programmed. Oh, I need to do some rewriting on this program.
Yes.
And that's it. It's not you're a bad person and no, this is the programming. Okay, you identified that. That's a start. That's a big, awesome start.
Yep.
That's self-identifying.
Too many of us think we're exempt from the programming and also exempt from the work and the reflection. And I think too many of us think, since we think we're exempt, we think that we don't have to have these conversations. We don't have to talk about this in the church over and over again, or we don't have to talk about this in just relationships. But something that I've heard from my African American friends is, we just want to have these conversations. We just want to with our white friends, right? Rather than pretend it's not there, rather than pretend this isn't part of our experience as people, as human beings. That's been incredible to me.
And we don't want to. I don't know anybody that wants conversations that make somebody feel bad. That's not where I want to go with this. I don't want anybody walking away feeling bad. I want you to feel hopeful.
Yes.
That's what I like to see is people begin to have some real hope. Like, okay, we've been going through this for a long time. Racism's been there a long time. Let's see that light. But by interacting with this, we can start seeing that light at the end of this very dark tunnel.
That's right.
And that's the only way you can go against something dark is by lighting something. That's what we're doing.
Now you're preaching, Julius. I mean, and that's where we, the church, if we can't do that, if we can't be that hope, if we can't be that light, if we can't have these conversations, what are we doing, right? So I'm super excited. I'm super excited that you shared that. I'm really, really grateful that you were willing to be vulnerable enough to share with us today something that just we need to talk about more. So, Julius, thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invite. This has been interesting and fun.
Yeah.
I hope something good comes out of it. I just need to do one last thing, and that is to plug my life coaching business.
Yep.
Moreflow.life. on the website.
Moreflow.life.
Yep. Instead of .com, it's .life. L-I-F-E.
Life coaching.
Just more flow. Yep.
Awesome.
And you can check me out on Facebook.
Awesome.
More Flow Life.
Awesome. Yeah, and people can ask us about that. But love you, Julius. Really grateful for you.
Love you too, Randy. Thanks.
So good to hear from Julius. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's just such a gift to us to hear it firsthand and just to know your heart and to hear your just compassion for the church. So thank you, Julius. Just pray for those of you who are tuning into this conversation and are listening. Just pray that you really receive his story as you carry on with how you're engaging with the world around you. That you carry the reality. Maybe you resonate with some of the trauma. Maybe you are really grateful to hear someone else share a story similar to yours, or maybe it's something that you're just really unaware of happening. And so whatever it is, just pray that you would be encouraged and just ready to step into this conversation with us. So love you so much. Just a reminder, we'll be at Greenfield Park next Sunday and really hope to see you soon. Love you all. Have a great week. Blessings on you and your families.